Russians of Reddit, what is the older generation's opinion on the USSR? Both my parents were born and raised in Kazakhstan. My dad's side fled to Germany sometime before the collapse, but my mum's side only had the opportunity during the collapse. She only recently told me that when everything started going to shit and all of the smaller countries decided they wanted to become independent states, the Russian government basically dropped the shared currency and introduced their new currency from basically one day to the next. When this happened, they had already booked their flights from their town to Moscow and then from Moscow to Germany, with a day layover. They were very much aware that they didn't have any money to spend in Moscow, but luckily the hotel was paid for by the German government. However, this still left them with the transport from the airport to the hotel. She told me that when they got there, none of the taxis would accept the old currency, even though people who were natives there could have taken the money and exchanged it for new currency without much hassle. They finally found a taxi driver who took them to the hotel and accepted their money, but she also said that he was very tense the whole time because apparently most airport taxis back then were controlled by the mob. Mum told me that before the collapse the USSR wasn't so bad, if you played your part. Dad's side of the family are, for the most part, still very nostalgic about the good old times when everyone had a stable job and a simpler life. But I also have to mention that my mum lived in a bigger city in the north close to the Russian border, and had thus access to more amenities and more importantly information, while my dad grew up on a farm in a small village in the far south and his family were largely self-sustaining. Edit. Sorry I spelled Kazakhstan wrong, I grew up speaking German and we write it Kazakhstan, also it was 12:30 and I was really tired. EDIT2, I only saw this now, thank you for my very first award, kind stranger, smiley face. It was the same in Estonia regarding currency. The collapse happened and the Soviet rubles were worthless overnight. My parents and uncles had just set up a small business that was relatively successful, making pierogies at my grandma's kitchen and selling them along cigarettes from a small kiosk near the bus station. The business was quite successful, but they did not accept the currency to be worthless overnight. If I remember correctly, everyone in my country was allowed to exchange 200 rubles for the new currency of our republic, krunes. The conversion rate was 10-1. Meaning everybody, including Klindren, got about 20 of the new currency. For reference, when Estonia joined the Eurozone the conversion rate was about 15,6 krunes equals 1 euro. Meaning everybody got to keep about 1.3 euros or about $2 worth of their hard-earned money in today's currency. We had bags, and I mean literal trash bags full of worthless rubles stashed at our summer house, and we would start fires with them and use them instead of chips when playing poker for years after. They stank a lot. I was born a couple years before the collapse. I still vaguely remember staying with my grandmother while my parents had to go stand for hours in queues for milk and sardelle, a kind of sausage that was boiled, sometimes to get nothing. Everything was a deficit. There was never enough of anything in the shops, and if people got a hold of a plastic bag somehow, from the free West, they carried it as a status symbol. Also everyone close enough to the Finnish Gulf would try to watch and listen to the Finnish TV/radio and record Western music off it. People would smuggle Finnish TV guides to Estonia so people could actually plan what they wanted to watch. My mother and I came here from a former Soviet Union state when I was 3. During her prime, she was a high-ranking medical officer, then afterwards she continued to be an OBGYN. She's in her late 60s now, but whenever I ask her how did our family live and what it was like, she always described it positively. For a family of doctors, mother, father, and grandmother were all doctors. We lived in modest high-rise apartment, 3 bedrooms, living room, couple bathrooms, kitchen, along with other tenants who had a wide range of occupations. Everyone in my town went to the same bazaar. We used to play soccer in the parking lot of the apartment building. My grandmother used to tell us stories of how hard it was in the beginning of the Soviet Union and through WW2. When she was around the age of 10 she was forced to work on a cotton farm until the day she passed. She would always avoid them. But, she was very fond of Stalin and genuinely supported him because of how peaceful things became after WW2. My mother acknowledges the negative things that he did, but she doesn't disagree of how good of a life she had. Up until the Soviet Union collapses and the states were overrun by corrupt autocrats, there weren't so many complications and difficulties as there are when we moved here. Day-to-day life wasn't as gloomy and shady as everyone likes to describe it in the West. I've lived in the US for most of my life. Life here is good, don't get me wrong, but if I can speak for the older generation of my family, I believe they loved the simplicity, camaraderie, and how much people cared for each other rather than compare themselves to others. Cumulatively, I've spent years in former Soviet states. Across all classes of people and almost regardless of their overall opinion of the Union, the loss of solidarity is lamented. One relatively well-off older person, late 60s, was explicit that her family was, from a material perspective, far better off than they were under the Soviet system. But she would also express consternation as to this same fact. She lamented that it strained relations with her friends. When they were young, they'd go on vacations together. It might not have been easy or frequent for them to arrange a trip to Moscow, but it could be done. She can now fly to Moscow, or Paris or most anywhere, Any day of the week, but not with her friends. She said she'd once paid for everybody, but it was awkward. She felt her, adult, children and descendants would be better off, but for herself preferred the Soviet system. Sure, could have been nostalgia. I'll admit partiality to the sentiment I got from a lot of poorer and less educated folks, which can be summarized as bunch of lying exploitative assholes then, bunch of lying exploitative assholes now. Only change is more fancy foreign cars. Camaraderie sounds right. I hear Russians today complain about how scummy people became after the 90s, when you only thrived if you were a savage. I particularly hate a scam from that time, I'm sure it still goes on today, sure sounds like it could, where criminals would prey on elderly apartment owners, and basically kidnap and dump them who knows where and then sell their apartment. Oftentimes the family didn't realize what happened until way too late. Then there's the story that someone told me very recently, where they overheard the father of a boy teaching him to be a classic bully on the playground. Oh, so they're not doing what you want? Tell them you'll rip their head off. Of course, this could happen in any country, but they insinuated that it's a holdover of the 90s. People survived this way, and teach their kids to survive the same way. Edit spelling. My family and I are from Odessa. My parents were born in the early 1960s. Generally speaking, they were what you'd call progressives today on most social issues, and they were both academics. In general they were quite happy living under the USSR, they had free education and free lodging. They grew up under a less restrictive Iron Curtain than their parents did, and they lived in a port city so it was easy to smuggle in things like fashion magazines, music, etc. The big things they hated were the food shortages in the 80s, the constant political education, and the big one anti-Semitism. My mom and her side of the family had a very different experience than my dad. For background, my mom's side is Russian, my dad's side is Jewish. My mother's family were true, good communists who were proud to serve their country and proud of their ideals. My grandfather was some kind of special forces military. And he was very, very proud of his country. My father's family were less enthused about patriotism and more concerned with surviving and remembering that even though our home city had been occupied by Nazis, the Soviets had killed many of our family as well. When my dad went to apply for a graduate program in physics in Moscow, there was an oral examination to get in. You answered questions essentially until you were wrong, most people were kept for an hour or two. What they'd do apparently to the Jewish students was they'd keep them for hours and hours longer until they finally made a mistake. They kept my dad for about 8 hours, and then told him he couldn't attend. He went to study in Siberia instead, which was very far from home and from my mother, and he was the target of anti-Semitic violence by the police there more than once. When she went to live with him, it was much harder to live in a small rural Siberian town than it was back home, and they really struggled. Still, my dad really loved the USSR. He loved his life doing research and never worrying too much about funding or tuition, the way I do now as a PhD student. He loved meeting students from all around the USSR and countries like Cuba. He was a ham radio operator and chatted with people all over the continent. Neither he nor my mom really wanted or needed a big house or fancy stuff, they were happy with their apartment, and though life was hard sometimes and they had to grow their own food or forage, to them it was just what you did. It wasn't fun or easy, but they don't talk about it as if they're angry about it. They did, however, absolutely hate the constant political education and having to recite whatever Brezhnev or whoever else said at whatever random day in history. We immigrated in 1996 to 24 years ago, on the day actually. After the inflation and general situation in Ukraine had become untenable. My parents don't like Putin and don't like strong men in politics in general, but they generally are wary about talking politics at all. They miss a lot of the life they had in the Soviet Union, they miss the music, my dad was really into the underground scene, and the art, the culture, the general values. They know that life wasn't great and they weren't well off by any means, but until the inflation got really bad they were pretty happy, and they think that things got much worse after the fall. My mom even misses the cause she picked fruit all summer in southern Ukraine, although my dad, who made bricks in Kazakhstan, is understandably a lot more ambivalent. The big thing that I'm sad about is that we lost all our Jewish religious observances because of the USSR, but on the other hand my parents were absolutely shocked when I told them how much debt I needed to take on for university, or when we moved to Canada and saw so many homeless people on the street in the winter. My parents live pretty comfortably now, my dad works as a software developer, my mom is retired, but when we moved, we had no money at all, and suddenly things actually became harder. Like, there was so much stuff to eat but my parents had no money, and weren't allowed by building regulations to grow stuff or have a garden, rent wasn't controlled, and my dad's PhD was suddenly absolutely worthless. My mom says being poor back home was bad, but at least she knew how things worked, how to deal with it, and knew that people cared about her when we immigrated. She felt that the country barely gave a shit about us at all. And my dad acknowledges that what the universities did was horrible, but as he points out, it doesn't seem like they let in too many different kinds of people into higher education here either. Born after the fall of the USSR, but both my parents grew up and lived in it. My grandmother was in the siege of Leningrad, and is still alive. There isn't much I can say, but my grandmother says it was overall a tougher time to live, however it felt more secure than now, and much more secure than right after the fall. The 90s in Russia were a mess and a half, where there basically was no functioning government or police. My parents themselves say that the 90s were so scary that they wonder if that was better during USSR times. Edit, grammar and spelling, as you can expect, English is not my first language. Another quick edit, woke up to an insane amount of upvotes in my first ever awards, so thanks kind internet friends. I belong to a Siberian ethnic group that faced repression during Stalinist era and after. Plus, a good deal of my family fought against the Soviets during the Civil War, a lot of them died or fled the country. My grandfather grew up in the Gulag and never had a good thing to say about the communists, like much of the family of his generation. He was branded son of the enemy of the state his whole life and always had difficulties living in the Soviet state. My mother and aunt, on the other hand, grew up when it was much more stable, food, utilities and entertainment were plentiful, they listened to rock bands, ate ice cream and watched international films, and a lot of their peers joined organizations like Pioneers and the Party, much to disappointment of my grandfather and his peers. However, 90s in Russia were absolutely savage, especially in Siberia. Normal functions broke down, currency was out of flux, people lost pensions, crime was out of control. My grandmother really missed and lamented the olden times in the 90s. Even though it wasn't as free, there was security, certainty, and overall hopefulness. My uncle was killed by a reckless driver in the middle of the day and the police essentially refused to investigate. Grandparents' dacha was vandalized and burglarized so many times without any concern from authorities, that my mild-mannered, university professor grandfather decided to guard it himself with a shotgun and ended up getting one of the guys. My view and that of my family is so because of the fact that we're a minority ethnic group in Russia. Even though my family has resided in Russia ever since they took over and colonized, even though I held Russian citizenship, ate bread, went to Banya on Sundays, spoke Russian as first language, native languages were illegal to be taught for a long time, I was never called Russian in Russia, and at times treated rather poorly on that account. Especially when I lived in Moscow I felt like a foreigner in my own country. I know I'm straying from the original question, but the overall point of this is to illustrate another dimension to the older generation's opinion of USSR prompt. I hope I didn't drivel. Stories like in this comment were everywhere at the time, they were, as horrible as it sounds, the norm in the 90s. The society was horribly disintegrated, raging racism, the economy in pieces, the mafia was ruthless, imagine having even the smallest business that could put you on the map, you were by default unsafe then. People were literally getting killed at their homes in front of their families, children were shot with their parents. Everyone was just trying to find their bearings after the Soviet Union collapsed by setting up small businesses, working in retail, making connections. Everyone from the regular crowd lived in constant fear. You either had to hide or fight back. You can imagine the choice that people were constantly being forced to make. I am an early 90s child of an Asian woman and a Middle Eastern man, raised in a tiny suburban town just outside of Moscow. I was never allowed to go outside without supervision up until I was a teen. It was confusing at the time as I wanted to play and be normal like other children were. I was about 7 to 8 however, when the slurs and the hate that was coming both from children and from adults started sinking in. My face is Asian, my last name is Middle Eastern, so I got the whole range of them, all of which are frowned upon here in the US but are still a part of a casual conversation in the country I was born in. And to answer the question of the original OP, I was discussing this with my parents just recently. They said that they miss the certainty that they had at the time and somewhat simpler lifestyle. You knew what you had to do to survive as long as you were a working middle-class citizen, keeping to themselves. Nowadays you can't be sure like that. But would they go back? Never. Wow. My mother is Siberian. Her grandfather was killed for refusing to fight in the military due to his religious views. She never knew any one of her grandparents. Her parents were farmers in a small Siberian village and she grew up poor, no running water etc. We moved to the US in '91 and to this day says how much simpler life is in Russia and how much safer it was and how dangerous it is to live in America. It boggles my mind but love for the motherland is strong I suppose. I'll branch off to say, this isn't just in the USSR. The USSR had so much power over Eastern Europe after the war. This influenced other countries. So not directly USSR, but my family came from both sides of communism in Eastern Europe. My mom's side, doctors, teachers. My dad's side, farmers, drivers, general laborers. My mom's side? Hated communism. My grandpa died a long time ago so I've never been able to ask him. But my grandma? She hated it, but because she grew up with it she never knew differently until she came to Canada to visit in the late 90s. She hasn't really changed her mind, but she sees the pros and cons of it. She grew up in and survived so she says it can't be that bad. But she's always been a minimalist. Literally she could enjoy life on just bread and water. My mom's family rarely had meat. They had one stick of butter to share between 4 people. My grandma, my mom, my uncle, and my mom's aunt, living in a small 2-bedroom apartment. The stores would run out of everything usually because there wasn't enough. Or was there? Onto my dad's family. Same town. This is before my mom and dad knew each other in a romantic setting. My dad drove a truck. He delivered food. When he was unloading everything, the shop owner would give my dad extra meat, extra chocolates, etc. In fact, no chocolates or sweets on the shelves. That was distributed between the drivers, the police, shop owners. Even on holidays. So, it really depended on who you were in these things. People who had the connections and power and corruption, they loved the old communist way, because they didn't have to put much work into getting everything. While people who were honest and tried to do their best, ended up getting screwed over with nothing. It became polarizing at points. My GF is in Vladivostok, her family is from Kiev. If I ever try to attack Putin, she defends him and I ask why. Her answer is, he turned the lights on. She was born 88. She says her early memories as a child were when the entire apartment block would meet at the intersection. Everyone must bring a piece of furniture. They would make a bonfire, all the babushka would cook dinner for their families. She said they told her Putin was now leader. Now the lights and heat came on, her parents received paychecks for their work. She will follow him forever. I don't get you about not being called Russian. If you are not ethnically Russian, do you want to be called Russian, ethnic? Why? If you are talking about being a resident of Russia, I was never called Russian in that meaning too, even though I am ethnically Russian. It's just not what people say.